Hi everybody, my name is Cheyenne Wido. I'm a senior psychology major here at Wilkes University. Joining me today is Sean Schmoyer, a senior communications major with a history minor. Today him and I will begin the discussion of the Charles Manson murder cases.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here and really excited to talk about the person of interest and his crimes that we're going to be speaking on.
So, I'm going to begin with some general facts about Charles Manson. He was an American cult leader whose followers carried out several notorious murders in the late 1960s. This resulted eventually in his imprisonment. He died in 2017 after spending more than 4 decades in prison. Manson is notorious for his connections to the brutal slaying of pregnant actress Sharon Tate. These murders were carried out by Manson's family cult, who referred to themselves as the Family. This was a group of over 100 followers who shared Manson's passion for a free lifestyle and the habitual use of drugs. Manson's followers also included a small, hardcore unit of impressionable young girls. They began to believe without question that Manson was a Jesus-like figure and his prophecies of an impending race war were true. Manson was influenced not only by drugs such as LSD, but by artworks and pop culture media of the time. Now, Sean, as someone who's a part of media, studies media, and has a history minor with knowledge of this time period, how do you believe it was a factor that influenced Manson's massive following?
Yeah, so before I begin, I'm going to be pulling from 2 major sources throughout tonight. I'm going to be looking at America in the 60s by John Robert Greene and a book called The Press on Trial, Crimes and Trials as Media Events, particularly the chapter The Case on Charles Manson and Plump White Rabbits by Robert Dardenne. When looking at media, there are kind of 2 broad definitions, the one that I work in, which is like newspaper broadcast, but also I think people who just talk about media often consider art, songs, pop culture, they consider that a type of media, and it is. So in that regard, the more pop culture aspect plays a huge role in Manson's influence over the members of the family, in that they're young, impressionable youths. They are kind of a part of this much bigger counterculture movement going on at the time. So the counterculture movement, and a lot of this is coming from the John Robert Greene book, the counterculture movement at that time was going against the norm. It was people who weren't just taking drugs and having sex because it was cool. They were doing it to take a stand. They eventually become, and even at the beginning, were partially anti-war with Vietnam going on. So you have these young, impressionable youths, because the counterculture movement tended to be those younger in a, lower, sometimes upper middle class spectrum. Something to consider is that, Manson wanted to be, and Dardenne talks about this, Manson wanted to be, a musician, a star, and he doesn't really get that. He kind of gets rejected, and that's where we see a lot of his anger come from with these murders. And in that regard, he understands the media that he starts to borrow from. So he takes the term Helter Skelter from the Beatles song that, has a strong influence over the impressionable youths he's working with. They know it, and he's able to pull that and use his charismatic personality along with, this figure he becomes in their eyes as a Christ-like figure, like you said. So in terms of a media perspective, plays a huge role on the members of the cult he starts to indoctrinate, but also broad-scale media that I work in plays a huge role in how we perceive the trial and how the, American citizens across the country viewed the Manson case.
Yeah, Sean, thank you so much for your insight on that. So, in beginning to talk about the murders, I'm going to be quoting from media source Jacob Shelton, who writes for Ranker.com, and he gives a timeline and information on the Manson murders. So, Los Angeles in the summer of 1969 was a hotbed of anxiety and fear. In just 2 short days, Charles Manson and the cult he referred to as the Family were able to commit acts so vicious and unhinged that they shocked the city. The timeline of Manson family murders played out at a breakneck speed with many overlapping events. Over the ensuing decades, the story of Tate LaBianca and his murders have been pieced together from tales of everybody that were involved that night. So, Charles Manson's alleged motivation behind the Cielo Drive and Waverly crimes was to be striking out against those who were in Hollywood, whom he believed had casted him out of their society. He also hoped that his chaotic plot would jumpstart the Helter Skelter. As Sean had mentioned, Manson used a lot of the culture during that time to further himself and gather a following, and Helter Skelter was a part of one of his grand schemes. It was a race-fueled apocalyptic scenario Manson believed was imminent to happen. So, as Sean stated, Manson really wanted to be this big music rock star icon. So the story of all of this begins March 23rd, 1969. This is when Charles Manson visits Sharon Tate's home during one of her photo shoots. So by early 1969, Manson had already felt as if he was pushed out from record Terry Melcher's life. He didn't even know Melcher had moved out of his Cielo Drive home, and in Melcher's absence, Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate, had moved in. So, March 23rd, Manson approached the house in search of Melcher. Instead, he found Tate doing a photo shoot with some of her friends. When she told Manson that Melcher had moved, the cult leader left the premises, and Tate then flew to Rome that following day. Continuing on, July 25th, 1969, Bobby Basilo slays Gary Hinman. Gary Hinman was one of the many music industry adjacent people Manson had befriended in the late 60s. Since Manson believed Hinman possessed a sizable cache of money in stocks, he wanted them within his family because it was common when he had taken people into his family that he also took their assets. At some point, however, Hinman got on Manson's bad side. Bobby claimed that this was because Hinman sold the family low-quality illicit substances over the course of 3 days. Manson and Bobby, as well as other family members, Susan Atkins, Mary Brunner, tortured Hinman with a samurai sword. Bobby admitted to stabbing Hinman in the chest himself. Following Hinman's brutal dispatch, the family wrote "Political Piggy" on the wall in his blood. Next to the inscription, they left what was meant to be a pawn symbol, hoping to incriminate the slayings on the Black Panthers. Continuing on, we get to the afternoon of August 8th, 1969. Manson announces that the family must kill again that night. Manson was prepared to jumpstart his plan of helter-skelter, an apocalypse resulting from racial tensions. He also sought to free family member Bobby from prison. To do so, he ordered his family to commit a crime similar to Hinman's slayings in order to confuse the police. The evening of August 8th, 1969, the family sets out for Tate's home. Watson and several other Manson family members, all high on speed, prepared for the Cielo Drive house. Manson told Watson that he shouldn't return until he had $600. If the cash couldn't be found at Melcher's former home, then Watson was to go from door to door until he had the money. The family borrowed a yellow 1959 Ford from one of the Spahn Ranch workers, telling him that they were just going to go to a concert in the city. Between them, they only carried 3 knives, one of which was broken, and a handgun. As they began to drive away, Manson allegedly stopped the group and said, "Remember to leave a sign. Something witchy." After midnight, August 9th, 1969, Tate and her friends are slain in her home. Once the family members arrive at Tate's Cielo Drive home, Watson snuck in through a window while his 4 companions waited outside. The 6 people in their house, including Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring, were all asleep. As Watson let the others through the front door, they then woke up the occupants and carried out their gruesome plan. In the midst of the attack, Abigail Folger, heir to the Folger coffee fortune, was chased onto the lawn and stabbed. She ultimately passed and was found out on the lawn in the morning. Sharon Tate was the last member of the party to face the Manson family, and although Susan Atkins would later claim responsibility for ending Tate's life, Watson most likely committed most of the brutality against her. After every member of Tate's party was killed, a family member used one of the victims' blood to scrawl "pig" on the house's front door as instructed by Manson. The family was hoping that this would shock the world. The early hours of August 9, 1969, the family then fled Tate's home. The family attempted to leave the area as quickly as possible. According to Watson's book, not until the group was in the getaway car did they realize they forgot the $600 Manson requested. After cleaning themselves off with a garden hose, the family drove down the winding road, disposing of their incriminating possessions one at a time. That morning, the family returned to Spahn Ranch. The group found Manson and other followers dancing without clothes on one of the ranch's movie sets. When he saw the members returning, he asked, "What are you doing home so early?" Watson wrote that he told Manson the state of the Tates' home, messy, chaotic, just as instructed. Manson then asked if any of them felt remorse for what they did. All of them responded that they did not. After the other family members went to bed, Manson allegedly pulled Watson aside, asking if their actions had successfully jump-started the helter-skelter. The afternoon, August 9, 1969, the family followed the news of the slayings through radio and local media. That night of August 9, 1969, Manson ordered the families to kill again. Despite Hollywood's horror at the Tate house's ritual killings, Manson still did not feel as if the group had communicated their point. Similarly, he doubted they'd truly begun the apocalyptic scenario of helter-skelter. Manson called together the previous night's culprits, with the addition of 2 more followers, Clem and Leslie. Watson wrote that Manson felt the group's acts at the Tate's house were too messy and that they needed to hit multiple houses in one night rather than just one. The group then gathered supplies and drove into the city to commit their second round of crimes. That night, still August 9th, 1969, Manson joins the family to slay the LaBiancas. Supposedly, Manson stopped multiple times to look into different homes and even a church before deciding on the home of supermarket executive Leno LaBianca. Manson and Watson entered the house first and tied up LaBianca and his wife before the other family members joined them. After committing the act, Watson carved war into Mr. LaBianca's stomach, and some of the family members used his blood to write things like "Rise," "Death to Pigs," as well as misspelled "Helter Skelter" on the refrigerator walls and door. That night, August 9th, 1969, Manson attempts to continue the second killing spree. Immediately following the LaBianca crime, Manson and follower Linda Caspian traveled through California. They wanted to plant LaBianca's wallet in what Manson thought was a predominantly black neighborhood. They then drove to Venice so Manson could commit a second slaying that same night. The cult leader wanted to attack an actor friend of Caspian, but his plans were foiled when Caspian purposely entered the wrong apartment. The family chose not to attack again that night, instead choosing to ditch all the remaining evidence of their crimes and hitch back to Spahn Ranch the early hours of August 10th. August 16th, 1969, police raid Spahn Ranch, where the Manson family had been staying. Although media depicted the Cielo Drive and Waverly attacks as ritualistic crimes, the police failed to draw a connection between the two. Authorities were monitoring members of the Manson family, but not for the Tate and LaBianca incidents. Instead, they were wanted for stealing Volkswagen parts that they intended to make doom buggies with, which is very interesting to me that they were doing that. Around dawn of August 16th, police officers raided Spahn Ranch, arresting Manson and many of his followers. When Manson asked the police why he was being arrested, he was relieved to learn that it was only because of theft. But unfortunately, the police at that time didn't have a valid warrant, so Manson and his followers were freed. Due to that incident, though, Manson got kind of sketched out, so he said that it'd be best to take all of his followers and move them where no one can get to them. So he takes the family, packs them up to Death Valley. This area was fairly inaccessible and served as the perfect hideout for him and his followers. October 1969, police raid the family's desert hideout. After the family vandalized a parked vehicle, rangers convinced the local sheriff's department to raid the family's makeshift campground in Death Valley. During the initial raid, police arrested 13 family members on charges of grand theft auto, but at the time, Manson was not present. October 12th, California Highway Patrol James Purcell returned to the ranch for another investigation. There he found Manson hiding in a cupboard. Purcell says that when he found Manson, the cult leader grinned and just said hi. At this point, no one suspected Manson and his followers were in any way associated with the Tate LaBianca slayings. Fast forward to November 1969, Susan Atkins brags about the Tate LaBianca's crime, which eventually led to the family's downfall. While in custody after being apprehended in Death Valley, Susan Atkins boasted about her involvement in the Tate LaBianca slayings, even fabricating some of the gruesome claims that since entered the Manson legend, including that she herself stabbed Tate. She was eventually arrested for murder. Prior to her end, Atkins rescinded her claims that she was the main perpetrator in the Tate LaBianca crimes. Watson wrote in his book that, while she was present at Cielo Drive, she never even entered the LaBianca home. Fast forward all the way to January 25th, 1971, Manson and his family are convicted. Manson was found guilty of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He and 3 family members were sentenced to death. The next year, however, capital punishment was outlawed in California and their sentences were reduced to life in prison. So, as I just said, we all know that the members of the Manson family received life sentences at their trial. But it was more than just the crazy sentence that got their attention. What the Manson family proceeded to do at the trial is what really shocked the world. Charles Manson was seen doing things like carving an X in his forehead to reject society. He had his most loyal women shave off their hair as a way to exile themselves from society, to break beauty standards, and they were even seen in unison holding hands, walking to court singing. all these things got the attention of the media. The media really exasperated what was going on. Sean, you've read a bit about the trials and about what happened. How do you think that the media affected the Manson trials?
Yeah, so it's the first thing when we talk about media impact is that, obviously there are a lot of social factors that play into how a trial goes and what the outcomes are, and it's really difficult without doing in-depth research to say exactly the ramifications of the media's coverage. But what we do know is that, firstly, leading up to the trials, you had mentioned that it was very difficult for the police to directly tie Manson and the family to the plethora of cases that happened. So the main two cases are the LeBlanc and the Tate murders that, the media winds up focusing on and kind of has an idea that those are murders that the Manson family commits. And what takes some time is that really the first 3 months of coverage of these murders are the media portraying not just the culprits or potential culprits, but also the victim, Sharon Tate herself, as kind of these people who were living under a heavy influence of drugs, a part of the hippie lifestyle, this glamour and quirkiness of LA culture, as Dardenne identifies. The Los Angeles Times was cited referring to the murder that her and her husband lived freaky, so they died freaky. There was this stigma that the media didn't understand, the media didn't and probably still doesn't understand the counterculture movement. They very much watered down what they were doing and just viewed them as irresponsible people who like to have sex, like to do drugs, and never really dug deeper than that. In the media's coverage of Woodstock when it occurred, the quotes they got from people in attendance were the ones who had bad trips, were the ones who, weren't there for really in-depth reasons but could be identified as reckless, as irresponsible. Because when you think about it, the media, even though it was around Vietnam time and coverage of Vietnam was, depending on who you ask, kind of an open bag where a lot of things were shown that were bad for the American government, that wasn't really till the end of Vietnam. The media coverage of most things back then and even today still falls in line with the standard norms because the media has to sell. And this is kind of where the coverage of the trials comes in, is that even though this is by far a more prominent thing nowadays, even back then, the media's main goal was to be relevant, was to get people to tune in, and was to continue coverage that was engaging. So you have these murders that, could be focused on in relation to gambling, drugs, orgy, black magic. You mentioned that Manson, wanted his family to make references to witches, and that was because those kind of things were around and were gossiped about at the time of being possibilities. So the media really picked up on that and ran with it. And you mentioned that Atkins, while the trial is going on, talks a lot about all these things that she definitely did that gets added into the, the mythos of the Manson murders that weren't true. Well, the media picks up on that coverage and really runs with it. It reports a lot of falsities, a lot of things that aren't accurate because that's what it hears in the grapevine. They're engaging, they're horrifying, they're brutal. They're the things that are really going to catch the reader's eye. And Dardenne in his book argues that for all the coverage and analysis of the Manson murders that the media gives it, the press failed to report on why society produces the people who committed the crimes, as he calls them, the damaged souls. And that never really comes to fruition in the immediate or even post couple of years after the Manson murder. I would even argue today that a lot of the focus on the murders is on Manson himself, his charismatic personality, how he could possibly have gotten these women to do these things, but more so in a, I would say, dangerous idolization of him still, because doing it like that and focusing on him gets people interested, as opposed to looking at the psychological or the socioeconomic reasons behind the family members who could be classified as victims for how they play into Manson's story, but how they get manipulated by him. And it's interesting because we talk a lot in media about this why question, and how in our modern day coverage, we often are there to get people to stay, to get them to listen, and then once we have them, we kind of want to keep doing that so that we get the revenue and get all the clicks we need to stay popular, but very little do we have the chance to talk about the why afterwards, or give even other people who know the reasons or are looking into the reasons why these things occur the chance to speak on that. And this is one of those opportunities where, I can't go too in depth for it, but this is a place where I can say the media made missteps, and we should be talking about the why that influenced these killings. And when people get the chance to, people like you who have the background knowledge to do it, and maybe in cooperation with people like me, we can figure out those whys.
Sean, I just want to thank you so much for your perspective on all of this, because being a psychology major, I can look at it from a psychological avenue, and there's a lot that could be said about Manson and the family and, victimization of the women. He just, perfect time, perfect place, perfect people to pick. But I think just with the media attention this case got, it turns more into a media issue and how media can skew justice. And when we think about it, sure, Manson was mentally ill, but it goes deeper than that this was a performance for him because he was an entertainer. I mean, like you've stated, he wanted to be a musician, he wanted celebrity, he wanted status, and when he didn't get it in a musical way, this was his way to do it. This was his grand performance, and the media just exasperated Manson into this glorified serial killer that so often in our culture now it's so common for people to just look at it and say like, oh, Jeffrey Dahmer, I love him, or oh, Ted Bundy, like I have so much to say about him, or he's my favorite serial killer, and it kind of just turned Manson into exactly what he wanted, an idolized figure. And like I said, I think the media just had so much to do with how the trial played out and how Manson got the status that he has today. And I really appreciate you taking time, even though you're not a part of this project, to come in and, use your background knowledge and talk about it with me. So thank you so much for being here.
And, I'll say, thank you so much for having me, and also, though, I'm always hesitant to say that the media has such a large role in something, but I'm also always willing and gladly going to admit that the media does play a role in lots of things, and the Manson murders, they for sure did. So, thank you again for having me.